Like I said last week, the schedule that's on the front of the booklets is a little bit out of whack because I've changed things a little bit, but we're kind of back on track, looking at the topic of literary context, which we all know is hugely important. If you hear a recording of me saying Peter Lang is a fool, you say, hang on, that doesn't sound right. And no, but you might not expect me to be saying that. But then if you listen to the full recording, you would hear me say, I would never say that Peter Lang is a fool. But if you clip out one phrase out of context, you can completely change the meaning. And it's the same. It's very critical with the Bible, isn't it? Because if we misunderstand what the Bible is saying purely because we haven't looked at the literary context, then we can misconstrue what God is saying to us. Let's just remind ourselves, a few weeks ago when we were looking at general principles of Bible interpretation, we talked about context as being one of them. We've already looked at the situational context, understanding the historical background and the cultural background to help understand whatever passage we're reading. We saw that in one sense that's not as vital because it may be that we can learn things about the situational context from extra-biblical sources or other places that can help inform us, but they're not determinative of what the passage is actually saying. But in this art of exegesis, of really digging in and trying to make sure that we know what the passage says and what it means and what it is saying to us, literary context is really important. And so we saw that there's kind of these different levels of literary context. There's obviously the phrase or the verse itself and its immediate, what it means immediately, and then its context within the section or the chapter of the book that it's in, then how it fits into the overall flow of the book itself, then how that book fits into I've got the word covenant there, meaning the Old Testament or the New Testament. So identifying, is it Old Testament or New Testament, and how does it fit into the overall story and flow of the Old Testament or New Testament? And then how does it fit into the Bible as an entire book and the entirety of the Bible's big story? So we're going to follow these steps, and we're going to still keep working on our passage in Jonah that we looked at last week. Remember, we picked up on just the first part of Jonah a few weeks ago, and then looked into most of Jonah chapter 1 last week. And this week you do have permission to have your Bibles open, because in fact you'll need to have Bibles open, because if we're going to look at the literary context of this passage, we need to look at what's around it and how it fits in. So the first question I'd like to ask is, what if the book of Jonah was just that? What if the story of Jonah and all we had ended with verse 16 and that was it? How would things be different? Or what would we not know that we do know because we have the complete book, if that was the end of the book of Jonah? Well, we obviously wouldn't know the fate of Jonah, or at least we might conclude that that was the end of Jonah. Thrown off the boat, he's drowned, that's it. No more Jonah. We might conclude or we might not know the fuller theological significance of that story. We just have to take it on face value and try and get what we can out of it, but we wouldn't know if there's any other interpretation or explanation or expansion or continuation of that story and what it is that God is wanting to communicate through this part of the story. We'll also would never know whether the Lord's intentions for Nineveh were fulfilled. We know that the Lord sent Jonah to Nineveh. We know that Jonah rebelled and went the opposite direction and ended up in the sea. So we might say, well, what happened to Nineveh? Did God have a purpose for Nineveh, and did it get fulfilled or not? Any other things that you think we might not know or would be different if that was all we knew? Yeah?
God's ability to do something out of good with science and nature. Like, in other words, God not able to do miracles.
Yeah. Especially when it kind of ends with, where is it? The sea ceased from its raging. So if that's the last word, then you just see it as, okay, well, the storm stopped. But was God involved in that or not? Yeah, was this actually the Lord's doing, or was this just a collection of cause and effect, random incidents that happened? Yeah.
Exactly thinking that. I was thinking ahead more with the 3 days and 3 nights.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So the Jonah in the fish. Yeah. So the Lord's miraculous saving and intervention of Jonah. Yeah.
I mean, we can't get any clearer about the sea than what we have in this passage. That it was a remarkable storm.
Yep.
And that Jonah said the sea will, you need to throw me into the sea. And when he did that, the sea calmed down immediately. Like that is almost miraculous. It is like an indication, and we don't get any more from the rest of the book about why the sea calmed down. So I would say that bit's pretty complete, really.
Yeah, that's true. Although I guess what I might say is that I'm not sure if we can say clearly from this passage alone that the Lord was actually actively doing something there. We know that the Lord hurled the wind upon the sea, but if you've got this limited view of God that God is just on the land and he can't come out into the sea, he could have hurled the wind from the sea and he's still distant, isn't he? So there isn't a lot there about the Lord actually being present and actually directly working as such, not explicitly there. Whereas I think Russ's point was when you hear about the fish and as you go on, you see that actually the Lord is actually right there with Jonah, working and speaking. Yeah. So we could infer from that this is the Lord's doing. It's a miraculous thing, but it's still a little bit vague, isn't it? It's not entirely clear. So, how does verse 17, the next line, and the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Just that one verse makes a big difference to how we read and understand that passage, because we see, well, the Lord hasn't finished with Jonah after all. This is not the end for Jonah. Yeah, he can't run away. The Lord's still got him, and the Lord must still have something to do if he's going to send a fish to swallow him and for him to be in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. The other thing that just that verse alone might say to us is Oh, 3 days and 3 nights.
Yeah.
I've heard that phrase before in the Bible. It happens a few times through the Old Testament, through this formula of 3 days, and it's often a time of preparation for something significant that God is going to do. Like the Israelites came to Mount Sinai and they were there 3 days and 3 nights before the Lord descended down on Mount Sinai. So it's often it's not just saying, oh, the Lord isn't finished with Jonah, but the fact he's in there for 3 days and 3 nights kind of says, and get ready because something even bigger than the stilling of a storm, or the sending of a storm and the stilling of the storm, is about to happen through this man who's being prepared for 3 days and 3 nights. So what we're going to do now is look at, it points, we know that phrase 3 days and 3 nights doesn't just occur in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament. So for us as Christians, we see that phrase and think, so there must be something significant in this story of Jonah that's going to link to Jesus, because Jesus used that phrase himself. We're going to look now at chapter 2 of Jonah and the prayer that he prayed. So as Russ pointed out, we wouldn't have known what happened to Jonah in the sea. If it had just stopped at the end of our chapter 1, we still would have thought, okay, he's swallowed by a fish, but what? But now we see, okay, here's what actually went on inside that fish for those 3 days and 3 nights, summed up in this prayer of Jonah. So how does Jonah's prayer shed light on, how does it help us understand more what was in the story, what was happening in the story of chapter 1? I can't remember what I've got on your handout. So have I got blanks or have I got just numbers? I've got blanks, okay. 1, 2, 3. I should have 2, 3, 4, 5 to 6, 8 to... Yeah, okay. So if you look at verse 2, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. So that tells us that the fish was actually salvation. That was the Lord saving Jonah. If all we knew was he was swallowed by a fish, we might say, well, that's even a fate worse than drowning. Not only do you get thrown in the ocean, but then a fish gobbles you up, and that's a pretty terrible way to end. But no, actually, Jonah, from inside the fish, sees that the Lord has heard him, the Lord has answered him, and has saved him from this fate by sending the fish. Verse 3, for you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me, and your waves and your billows pass over me. What does that tell us? What more does that tell us about not only the storm and the sea, but what took place in the story in chapter 1?
God's working through other people. He's working through the sailors and through him.
Yeah.
Jonah perceives that as God's doing.
Yeah, exactly. He doesn't say, for the sailors cast me into the sea, or I said, throw me into the sea. Those two things are true, but it was actually the Lord's doing. The Lord is sovereign, and he's the one. The sailors and Jonah's idea of throwing me into the sea, that was just the means that God used, but ultimately it was the Lord's doing, which says, well, that was actually a part of God's sovereign plan to have Jonah end up in the sea. Jonah thought he was in control of his destiny. The Lord had other plans, and it was the Lord's doing to put him in this place. Verse 4, then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall look again upon your holy temple. The first part of verse 4, then I said, I am driven away from your sight. Again, how does that throw new light on what happens in the story? It's similar to verse 3. What would we conclude if all we had was chapter 1 and the story in terms of Jonah and the Lord's presence? We were told, weren't we, that Jonah arose and fled from the Lord's presence. So again, from Jonah's perspective, initially, he was responsible for going away from the Lord, running away from the Lord's presence. But now he's realised, no, I've got to rethink that one too. I am driven away from your sight. Jonah's intention was flee the Lord's presence, but he actually deserved, because of his disobedience, the judgment of being cast from the Lord's presence. And he realised the place he is in now, it wasn't just his foolish decision, but it was actually an action of God's judgment or discipline that is in this place. Yet, second half of verse 4, what grace that he'd been saved. So I was cast or driven from your sight, yet again I shall look upon your temple. Yet you've saved me, even though you drove me away, now you're going to bring me back. Verses 5 and 6, just before then, see how Jonah mentions the temple twice in his prayer, there in verse 4, and then down in verse 10, verse 7, it should be, my prayer came to you in your holy temple. Remember how Jonah, in the story at least, thought about the Lord's presence, or how the Lord's presence was portrayed in the story, that Jonah could get on a ship and flee from the Lord's presence. Now he's talking more, he's not so much talking about the Lord's presence in that way, he's talking about the Lord's temple, which was understood to be the location of the Lord's presence. So he's thinking of this in terms of the fact that we know, remember, Jonah was from the northern kingdom. He was the prophet to King Jeroboam in the northern kingdom. Where was the temple located? In Judah, in the southern kingdom. And there's this big rift between the north and the south. And Jonah, the prophet from the north, is acknowledging the Lord's presence in the temple down in Jerusalem, in Judah. So there's a significance in that. And also the fact that he thought he was going away from the presence of the Lord, but now he's even saying, well, I'm at the bottom of the sea inside a fish, yet you still hear me from your temple. You can't go any place where the Lord cannot see you or hear you. Yeah. Okay, verses 5 and 6. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. At the roots of the mountains, I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. Did Jonah actually die, do you think? Or was it a symbolic? Did he literally or figuratively die? I've always thought of this story as Jonah, it's going down in the water and, holding his breath and then he's rescued by the fish and he doesn't actually die. But looking at it more closely, I think, well, the waters closed in over me to take my life. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. To me, that sounds like the actual language of going down into Sheol, into the place of the dead. So I wonder whether Jonah did actually literally die. And so it wasn't just a figurative thing of him looking like he was dying and coming back to life, that it was actually a death and a resurrection. The Lord actually brought him back to life.
This is an example of where we have limitations we place on who God is and what God can do.
Yeah, yeah.
And God's the creator of everything from nothing.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people that, scoff about this story. It's the biggest joke to people about Christians or
Yeah.
But if God is creator of everything from nothing, well, this is easy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
God provided somehow, we don't know how.
Yeah.
And because otherwise, how could we survive more than a very short time, not being able to breathe or what?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we can get caught up in all the discussions about, well, could it really have been a fish? Could a fish really have swallowed Jonah and survived 3 days and 3 nights? And but I wonder if the real question is, could God actually get someone who's sunk to the bottom of the ocean and is dead, stone dead, and actually raise him from the dead? That seems to be the point that Jesus is making, isn't it? When he says, just as Jonah was in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be. He's saying this. What happened to Jonah was a death and resurrection. But yeah, we can't say definitively from the text, yes, Jonah definitely died. But I think when we just looked at that first part of the story and we said, well, if it was just that, we would have concluded Jonah was finished. I think this kind of language, at least from Jonah's perspective, is, yes, I was finished. I was in an absolutely lost, helpless situation where, humanly speaking, there was nothing, no future, and now God has brought my life up from the pit, from the place of the dead. So it really, I guess, strengthens that finality of what happened when Jonah was thrown over into the water. And then finally, verses 8 and 9. To those who pay regard to vain idols, forsake their hope of steadfast love. But with the voice of thanksgiving, I will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Now, any thoughts on how that sheds some light on the first part of the story? Have a look at 1 verse 16. Do you see a parallel in any way there? So there's vows, there's sacrifice and vows made by the sailors, isn't there? Jonah says, I will sacrifice to you, and what I have vowed I will pay. So there's a deliberate parallel there between what's happened to Jonah right at the end and what happened to the sailors. Jonah now knows to be true what the sailors experienced. They were calling out and crying out to their gods who are vain idols, and it didn't work, did it? Then they cried out to the Lord, and the Lord saved all of them, and so they sacrificed and made vows. And now Jonah has, I guess you couldn't say he's learnt the lesson from the sailors, because he was already in the water when they made their vows and made sacrifices, but we are to learn that lesson, aren't we? Do we call out to vain idols and forsake our hope of steadfast love? Or do we cry out to the Lord, which for an Israelite meant offering sacrifices and making vows to him?
You think the sailors know that Jonah in swallowed up?
They probably know nothing from that point on. All they know is we've got rid of this man, and this man's God has saved us, so now we'll worship him. And last week we said we can't say for sure whether the sailors said, okay, from now on we're going to be worshippers of Yahweh, or whether they just said, okay, we need to add to all the gods that we sacrifice to as sailors, you know, the God of the wind and the God of the sky and the God of the sea. We also need to sacrifice to this, add this God to all of our gods. But this verse would tend to make us think, no, the sailors, if Jonah as a prophet, an Israelite prophet, is saying, this is my response to your salvation, so well, it seems as if maybe the sailors were, their repentance maybe was genuine. It was a true turning to the Lord, because they were actually unknowingly doing what the law required, when Jonah, who knew the law, wasn't doing what the law required. It's a little bit like in Romans, the beginning of Romans, where Paul says, these Gentiles, who you Jews say are terrible people, often they do things what the law requires without even realising that's what the law says, because it's written on their hearts and their consciences. That seems to be what's coming out here, that the pagan sailors knew more about worshipping the Lord in reality than what Jonah knew in theory. All right, so that's the context of the chapter, or the larger section that our passage is in. Let's now go a little bit further out and think about the book, how chapters 1 and 2, or chapter 1 in light of chapter 2, sets the scene for the rest of the story. And I'm going to just kind of presume knowledge of the rest of the story, but Jonah being a fairly well-known book, we know that he then went to Nineveh, he preached, the people of Nineveh repented, the king of Nineveh said, let's repent, and then Jonah got upset, didn't he? Because he didn't want the Lord to save the Ninevites, he wanted to see Nineveh consumed in fire and brimstone, and he had to be taught by the Lord about how the Lord was even concerned for this great city that wasn't even a part of his chosen people. Well, here are some ways that how understanding all this helps us understand the rest of the book. We see that the sailors become a model for what would happen in Nineveh. So the Lord's purpose was, send my prophet to Nineveh, they hear my word, they repent and they're saved. And Jonah doesn't want that to happen, but then he does it with these sailors on the boat as an example of what's going to happen next. So have a look at, compare verse 1 verse 6 to 3 verse 9 and see what the parallel is there. 1 verse 6, which is the words of the captain, and 3 verse 9, the words of the king. How do they correspond with each other? What's the words of the captain in the boat? What do you mean? Arise, call it you. Yeah. Maybe you'll take notice to us. The ESV says, perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish. What about 3 verse 9? Yeah. Who knows? Kind of sounds like perhaps, doesn't it? Who knows? God may turn and relent and turn from his, so we may not perish. See how it's different words, but the same, basically the same thing. The captain's saying it and the king's saying it in response to, I guess the sailors were right in the face of God's judgment in the form of the storm, whereas the people of Nineveh weren't seeing it at the time, but they'd been warned of it, of the coming judgment. But then look at 1 verse 15 and 3 verse 10. and see the parallels. 1:15, they picked up Jonah, hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging, which we've already seen. What that really means is the Lord stopped the sea from raging, because we've seen that the Lord's behind all of that. 3 verse 10, when God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it. So there's this, the captain and the king cry out, maybe this God can save us, and then God hears the prayer and saves them. So that's one thing we see by looking at how the story fits into the whole book. The other thing that we see is, that's a misspelling there. It should say confirmation, not conformation. Confirmation to Jonah of the character of the Lord. See how in his prayer he expresses something of God's character, his salvation. Even the fact that it says he prayed to the Lord, his God. It's a very personal thing here. We actually haven't seen Jonah directly address the Lord yet before this, have we? God's always at arm's length, in a sense, in chapter 1. Here, Jonah is actually speaking directly to him and speaking about, you brought my life out of the pit, O Lord, my God. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And the mention of the temple is a reference to God, who is the covenant God of Israel. So in this experience, Jonah gets upset in 4 verse 2. He's prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is this not what I said when I was in my country? I knew that you are a gracious God, merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, relenting from disaster, which is straight out of when the Lord revealed himself to Moses in the context of giving the covenant. This is who I am. This is the God who was entering into covenant relationship with you. So Jonah is having this confirmed to him in this experience. Yes, this is the character of this God that you are trying to flee from and disobey. And so it's right there. So in chapter 4, he says, I knew that you were this kind of God, and it's been drilled home to him through this experience. Now, there's many other things, but they're just 2 examples of how, again, seeing the passage in the context of the whole book helps us understand it more. The next circle out is that of covenant, or the testament, how Jonah fits into the whole Old Testament story. I just could say this question is, why did God include this book in the Bible? What purpose does it serve by having the book of Jonah in this entire document, this collection of 39 books that we call the Old Testament? So, how does the book of Jonah, fit into the overall story of the whole Old Testament story? Well, if we continue reading in 2 Kings and in 2 Chronicles, we know that Jonah was a prophet at the time of King Jeroboam II, and then there's about, I can't remember how many, 6 or 7 kings after Jeroboam, and Jeroboam was a bad king. The kings who came after him were getting worse and worse. In fact, 1 or 2 of them are just as bad as the Assyrians. One of the kings who came, I think it's about the 3rd one after Jeroboam, the only thing we're told about him is that he went somewhere and he ripped open the stomachs of pregnant women. Right? So it's kind of, there's this downward spiral of the kings of the northern kingdom, just straight down into evil and corruption. And eventually, because of that, judgment upon them by God sending the Assyrian army down to invade them. So if Jonah fits into that time and was written either during or just after the time of Jonah, and therefore was being read and heard by the people of the northern kingdom of Israel as they were experiencing this corruption and evil and injustice? What kind of message did those people need to hear at that time? That God would give them both the prophet Jonah, but then the book of Jonah for them to read. Well, they would have had to know that the Lord has not changed, despite what's going on in the kings. He will continue to be faithful to his covenant. There's a kind of assurance that they would have needed. They would have needed to know, as they saw the Assyrians eventually coming down and being incredibly cruel to them, that the gods of Assyria are actually just vain idols. They're not real gods. Yahweh is still the Lord. He's still in charge of he's above all of these gods. And remember the belief that if one nation defeats another, it meant that that nation's gods are more powerful than the gods of the nation they defeated. But Israel needed to know, no, even if Assyria comes and defeats you, that does not mean their gods are greater or more powerful than Yahweh. That means then, if Yahweh is more powerful than all the other gods, and they're just imaginations and vain idols, that means the judgment, what happened when Assyria came down, that was actually the Lord's doing. It was actually his action of judgment on them, not just a terrible coincidence. And they needed to know that this will not be the end for Israel. Despite their disobedience, they are still part of God's purpose to fulfill the Abrahamic promise and covenant. So, among other things, there would be the three things that they would need to know at that time, and they're things that are communicated to them through the book of Jonah. Okay, and then finally, the next, we know as we read the rest of the Old Testament story, that the Old Testament story didn't stop with Jonah, and it didn't stop with the Assyrians invading. There's much more, isn't there? Even though the Assyrians invaded, God still preserved Judah, and even though Judah was later invaded, God still preserved the remnant of the exiles and then eventually brought them back. So God continues to keep his promises, keep his covenant, and be faithful to his people. Okay. The final circle is that of canon, how Jonah fits into the whole Bible. And the first question to ask might sound like a dumb question. Is Jonah before or after Jesus? Well, I hope it sounds like a dumb question to you guys. Well, for some people it may not be obvious. You know, we know that because if we're familiar with the Bible story, we know the difference between Old Testament and New Testament, but not everyone realises that, and especially if people are just reading the Bible on their device, they don't get the sense of, oh yes, here's a book and there's part 1 and part 2, and Jonah is in part 1 and Jesus is in the middle between them. Why is it important though to identify that the passage we're reading and the book that it's in is before or after Jesus? Well, for one thing, it helps us identify aspects that foreshadow in the old. So what is it if we're before Jesus, we'll look for things that are pointing us forward to the new covenant that comes in Jesus. If we're reading a New Testament passage, we take note that this is after Jesus, therefore I should be seeing things in this passage that are for a fulfillment of what came before Jesus. So just getting that historical perspective right is important for understanding the passage. But also in the area of application, knowing what still applies to us as Christians on this side of Jesus or things that have been made obsolete. For example, in Jonah's prayer, as I pointed out, he talks about the temple. The Lord hearing, I will look upon your holy temple. You heard me, my prayer came to you in your holy temple. Now, if this was a New Testament book, we would say, okay, there is still a significance, obviously, there of the temple, isn't there? But we'd say, no, this is Old Testament, this is before Jesus, this is before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, before Jesus fulfilled all the types and shadows in the temple. Therefore, we don't need to take those words of Jonah as an indication that we should be praying to God in a temple or expect his presence to be just contained in a temple. And one last thing, Jesus and the Samaritans. Remember, the Samaritans in New Testament times, they were the remnant of the northern kingdom of Israel. Most of them had been taken off into exile, but a handful had been left, and then other nations had been imported and they'd intermarried and mixed, but the Samaritans were essentially still that northern kingdom, and obviously the Jews didn't consider them to be truly members of God's people. But if you see the way Jesus related to Samaritans, you see, well, actually whenever he related to Samaritans and talked to Samaritans, it seemed as if he was including them and expecting them that they would be as much a part of the new covenant as the people in Judah were. Okay, we'll stop there and have a break.